Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today is the weekend review show for the weekend of November 8th through today, November 10th. We had 4 new wide releases, Midway, Dr. Sleep, Playing with Fire, and Last Christmas. We'll do semi-deep dives on each one of those, then walk through the rest of the top 10. Then we have a great timeline segment from Chris. He's going to walk through this weekend in 1994 and then talk about 3 new movies that are coming out for the next year or so that he thinks that are interesting to follow. And then we'll close out the show with talking about what's going to happen the next few weeks at the box office. But let's get started here at the top 10. Very surprising weekend, kind of a crazy weekend with all these 4 new wide releases. They're all in the top 4 spots. No one had any real idea, what was going to be number 1. The assumption was that Dr. Sleep was going to run away with it, but by the time Thursday previews came in, it got all jumbled and we didn't know what was going to happen. So here's what did happen. Midway, the Roland Emmerich World War II movie, which I have been kind of shitting all over for the last few weeks. Like, no one's going to see this except old people. Well, it turns out there's a lot of old people who wanted to see this World War II movie. So Midway ended up being number 1, while Dr. Sleep tailspinned into second place. So really strange weekend here that happened. No one really expected Midway, I think, to take number 1. There was a lot of thought that even like Last Christmas, which was in 4th, was going to beat Midway. What really happened here is Dr. Sleep essentially blew up. It blew up on the launch pad. No one went to go see it. Had a big wide release, tons of marketing, and it massively, catastrophically flopped. So we'll do a deep dive into Dr. Sleep after we talk about Midway here. But Midway from Lionsgate, Roland Emmerich did Sleep back in the day, Independence Day. Chris is going to talk about a little bit what he did in his Time Machine segment, because he's going to talk about Stargate, which is a movie that I will hold my commentary until after the Time Machine segment, because I did just revisit Stargate like a few months ago, and I have some thoughts on it. In any event, he's been active for a long time. He's known for very cheesy action movies from the 90s, and he's continued to do that till today. That's why I thought Midway seemed just sort of like a throwaway cash grab. $100 million budget though for Midway, which is a lot of money to give Roland, because he's like, you never know what you're going to get with him. Could be Independence Day 2, which probably lost like $100 million, or he get one of his big win movies, and this is going to be a win, it looks like. So Midway was number 1, 17.5 million on the weekend. Per theater average was about 5,400. I'm looking at that number. I was like, that's not very good for a number 1 win here. This is a really down weekend at the box office. I think Deadline was quoting as like 28% off of last year. So just very quiet across the board. Let's talk a little bit more about Midway, what people thought about it. Rotten Tomato scores here, 41% from all critics. That's a rotten score, 52 actual score. Top critics are even less, 38%, and a 51 actual score. So critics hated it. Verified audience score, 91% on Rotten Tomatoes from ticket buyers, 90 actual score. All audience, 87%, 86 actual score. So already we see this huge discrepancy here. Critics hated it, audiences really like it. Cinema score of an A, also a good sign. Post track of an 80%. Definite recommend was a little bit lower than I'd like to see for something like this, a 58%. Normally, for a movie that's getting an A cinema score, 91% verified audience score, you'd think the definite recommend would be a lot higher. But it might be one of those movies where people showed up, I got what I wanted out of it, but I wasn't blown away. So they gave it the A, they gave it the 90%, but they don't feel like recommending it to other people. So what does that really mean? Word of mouth legs may not be as strong as an A cinema score would suggest. Letterboxd score 54 out of 100. That makes sense. There's not a lot of World War II movies anymore. We're in a really strange stage with like World War II remembrance, I guess, or nostalgia. In the 90s, if you were, aware back then and can see movies, it was a reverence period, right? We had A Thin Red Line. We had Saving Private Ryan. A lot of the World War II generation was dying off. Everybody I knew that fought in World War II, whether it be great uncle or grandfather, whatever, they all passed away in the 90s. And so that whole generation, the greatest generation, as they were called, which is so ridiculous when you think about it. It's kind of insulting to the rest of us. But anyways, they did do some great things. they started to die off in the 90s. So there's this sort of like, oh, we need to remember them. Let's tell their story. And a very sort of glowing look at World War II on some level. We also got like Schindler's List and stuff like that. And as we went into 2000s, we still held on to that sort of reverence sort of vibe for World War II movies. But now it's really gotten away from that and transitioned over to sort of like parodies like Jojo Rabbit or like Overlord, which is kind of using the World War II as a setting, as a vibe. We've definitely gotten really far away from the pure reverence movies of World War II. But I think Midway might fall into that. It seems a little cheesy and schmaltzy for that, but I think it does fall into that category. But a 54 score on Letterboxd. I just mentioned these two movies. Jojo Rabbit has an 80. That makes sense. Art movie people are into that film. But again, parody. It's not obviously not reverence for the Nazis or anything like that, but like it's a parody of Nazi Germany, of Adolf Hitler, of Nazism in general. And there's just a lot of layers to it. It's not like something like The Pianist, where it just shows you, oh, wow, World War II is awful. There's something a little bit more, I think, complex going on there with something like Jojo Rabbit. Overlord, again, 66 on Letterboxd, kind of similar to Midway. Dunkirk, probably the most famous World War II movie of recent memory, 78 on. That's definitely a film Twitter movie. Everybody loves Dunkirk and Christopher Nolan. I didn't think it was that good. I thought it was okay. But then like I revisited it. I saw it again, maybe like a year afterwards, or maybe a couple years afterwards. And it had a little bit more effect. I just don't think there's a real story to the first. Maybe I'm an idiot. I just thought, whatever. Film Twitter loves it a lot more than this. But I found a really good match for Midway on the Letterboxd score. And that's why I use Letterboxd, because I feel it's just a little bit more accurate. And it gives us a third perspective outside critics and mass audience on what the sort of quality of the film is. Monuments Men. If you remember that sort of like, where all these A-list actors decided to sign up for this movie to go to Europe and film this stuff and probably get drunk together. It was kind of a fun movie for them to film. The actual movie itself was not very good. Also got a 54 on Letterboxd. And it kind of feels that similar level of quality where, yeah, it's set in World War II. It's not like super dark like a Schindler's List, and it's not like super light like a Jojo Rabbit or sort of like meta. It's just kind of a middle of the road film. And we know that works with older people, especially in America. It's also Veterans Weekend. So I think that was the number one quadrant here, was men over 25. They love this movie. Lionsgate essentially is, I think, already making money on this, according to Deadline. I think, what did they say? At the $30 million range. Okay, so that's to double what it's doing now. At the $30 million mark, Lionsgate will start making money. I don't know how this works. Deadline has a whole write-up about this, at least a couple of paragraphs about how Midway was financed. But it essentially cost $100 million. $65 million domestically is the break-even point. Is that going to happen? I mean, I don't even think... So I'm talking like glowingly like this movie's doing well, but now I'm looking at the numbers. I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. If it does $17.5 million this weekend domestically... what are we looking at tops overall? 52. It might leg it out to like 60, but that's just break even point. Lionsgate, I think, set it up financially where they're going to win no matter what. But I think overall, and it was supposed to do well in China, and it's not doing well in China. So I don't know financially if this thing's really going to be profitable or a big win for Lionsgate. Well, it's going to be a win for Lionsgate, but I don't think everybody else, especially in the foreign markets, they may not make a lot of money off of this thing, despite it being number one this weekend. Lionsgate did UK-US distribution. They spent about $40 million on the marketing budget, which is very, very low for a movie like this. Just US alone, marketing for $100 million wide release movie, at least 50 into $60 million just for marketing. So they did not spend a lot on this, and I think they're going to make out okay. The rest of the people involved, that's how complex this all gets, right? Like, there's all these different deals in different countries. One company might make out here in the States, but over in China, they may not make any money off of this film. So it's kind of an interesting road to success here, or failure, for Midway. Who showed up for this? Obviously older people. Females over 25 was 30%. And then what else we have? White people were 60% of the audience, which is a little bit higher than normal. Latinos was 15% lower than normal. They're usually in the low 20%. African Americans went right in line with normal, but 11-12% of the audience. Asian other 15%. Usually it's only 7%. So that was pretty over indexed on this. projected only to make about $12 to $14 million this weekend. So it did quite better than that. And Veterans Day is tomorrow, so it should have a really strong Monday. It's surprising for a lot of reasons. One, I didn't think old people would show up for this. I thought this era of World War II movies was over. So I was wrong about both of those. Roland Emmerich, he has such a spotty track record. I can't believe somebody gave him $100 million to make this movie, but it happened. And it looks like it might work out for some people, and it probably won't work out for other people. But the story, the 17.5 million, is not really the story here of the weekend. It's Dr. Sleep. So let's dive into Dr. Sleep at number 2. Only did 14.1 million, opened in 3,800, almost 3,900 theaters, per theater average. And this is just abysmal. $3,700 per theater on an opening weekend for the sequel to The Shining, released from Warner Brothers. A major studio with a super wide release with a massive marketing campaign can only pull in $3,600, $3,700 per theater. I mean, that's a complete disaster on so many different levels. So let's dive into it and see sort of what happened if we can't pick apart why Dr. Sleep is such a massive failure here. You have a great director, Mike Flanagan. What's really perplexing to me is I've been talking up this film ever since I did the fall movie preview. I was like, this one feels like it's going to break out. You got Mike Flanagan involved. You did The Haunting of Hill House, which is a fantastic Netflix series. I'm kind of wondering, what sort of things had to fall into place for this to fail, essentially, because there's a lot of elements that looked like it was going to succeed. Critics gave it a 73% score on Rotten Tomatoes, so okay. 69% actual score, that's not so good. Top critics was actually totally different. 52% score, way below normal critics. 63% actual score. So already off the bat, there might be a little bit of a quality problem here. But then you go to verified audience. Verified audience is a 91%. Ticket buyers gave it a 91% out of 100. 88 actual score. All audience very similar. 89%, 86 actual score. Cinema score of a B+. Well, normally you'd say, no, that's okay, but it's a horror film, so that's actually really good. You gotta curve the cinema score about a grade up. So this is more like an A- for a normal film. Post track 80%, 60% definite recommend. Not super high, but okay. So we already have a mixed message here on quality. Oddly enough, the critics seem to like it less than the masses. Letterboxd, the film Twitter art snobs here, what do they say? 72 out of 100, which is an okay score. Compared to Us this year, 76. It Chapter 2 is a 62, so higher than It Chapter 2 by 10. I think the really interesting comparison here is the Halloween 2018 version, which came out last year. That got a 66 on Letterboxd. And then I also put in here Blair Witch 2016 got a 48. So like a lot of remakes I'm talking about. But I think Halloween makes sense because you're bringing something back that horror movie fans love. They love the Halloween series. They love The Shining. So why did this not connect at all anywhere near the level of It Chapter 2, Halloween 2018, or Us? It just did not set people, didn't hype people up to get out to the theater. $50 million production budget on this. The expectation it was going to make $25 million. I had it coming in at about $30 million, $31 million to be exact. And then, so what the hell happened? So we break down sort of postmortems, at least immediate postmortems, into 4 different categories, right? Product conception, product quality, marketing quality, and then marketing sort of quantity and targeting. Sort of the creative and the operations, kind of each side of that coin. So in terms of the product itself, does it make sense to make this movie? And I think on the surface, I think it does. The book came out, in 2013? It's the sequel to The Shining. So obviously they're not just making a random movie that's a sequel to The Shining. It's based on a book written by, the original author, Stephen King. There's a lot of Stephen King stuff out there right now that's doing pretty well. Obviously the It series is I think the biggest horror series ever. So that's a good sign that this might do well. Also, his movies his books got adapted to movies on Netflix, like Gerald's Game, very well performing overall. People really enjoy those films. So I think the conception here makes sense. Production budget was kept very low at 50, somewhere in the 50s. We don't really know for sure. So that wasn't really an issue here. They weren't throwing money at this, which is par for the course, even for what I would call like an A-list top tier horror film like this, they're not going to give you more than $70 million to do it. I think It Chapter 2 is $70 million. That's the most you're going to get. So they often, they keep the production budgets way below normal for a big movie. Because, let's be honest, like a comic book movie averages starts at 150 for about triple this, and on up to 200 and higher. So it's not really in that world. So if they do lose money on this, which I think that they will, it won't be a ton. But that doesn't really tell us why it failed. So I think the conception here made sense. The product quality, critics weren't super keen on it, but the verified audience and post-track and cinema scores gives me the mass reading, and the masses kind of like it. They don't hate it at all. They don't necessarily think it's the greatest movie ever, but they really enjoyed it, is the vibe that I'm getting from these scores. So it's not really a quality problem. Deadline brings up a couple of things. One, they bring up runtime. Was it, we can relate that to quality. Is this thing going too long? I don't buy that argument. Sure, it cuts out a show or two every night, and that's obviously going to shave off some cash. But people, it's not like the two other shows are completely sold out. There's no extra capacity, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like I guarantee you, the 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock shows were not sold out. So I don't think runtime was a huge factor here in this flopping so hard. And let's make no mistake, like this is a huge flop. It's half of sort of expectation of what this thing was going to make. I think the more, the better line here that Deadline has, and I think a better critique, is how they marketed this film to younger people. And Deadline brings up this concept that I think The Shining was in Ready Player One, and people really love that at South by Southwest. The Shining is sort of a pillar of nerd culture at this point. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, I don't believe. It just didn't feel like it. But I think over the last 20 years, as horror's become more popular and more sort of accepted among a wider group of people, and The Shining is considered essentially the greatest horror film ever made, or one of them. It has become sort of a nerd icon film, if that makes sense, especially among horror people. So it's fascinating. I don't think that they leveraged The Shining as much as they could have here. When I first saw this trailer, the initial part of it, I was like, wait, what is this? I don't follow Stephen King. I haven't read Dr. Sleep. I have no idea what it was. I was a little confused. And then they showed me the Shining clips, and I was like, I recognize that as The Shining, of course. But what is this? Is this like a remake? Is this a sequel? What's happening here? The marketing was extremely confusing when it started out. And I don't think they tapped into that nerd culture as much as they could have here, because the nerd culture is essentially the vanguard, right? If the nerds sort of latch onto it, they will talk about it on YouTube and on social media, and then it spreads kind of like a virus, or a mental virus, a meme, whatever. I prefer the term virus. It makes more sense to me. It's more insidious. And that didn't happen here. There was very little hype for Dr. Sleep from the nerd people on Reddit or on Twitter. Didn't really hear much about it at all. It's fascinating because you didn't hear it from the sort of the fanboy nerd culture. You also didn't hear any hype from the film Twitter people, which is more like the A24, the Lighthouse, Jojo Rabbit crowd. They didn't seem super into it too. And thirdly, I think the only group that really seemed to wanted to see this was horror people, which is its own sort of subculture that's not necessarily related to film Twitter or the nerd culture. There's a whole sub culture of horror people that seemed pretty excited about this film, but they weren't probably enough to really have it break out at all. I mean, I'm sure that they showed up opening weekend, but like that's how it got to $15 million. The other people didn't, and that excitement and hype did not spread to the general audience at all. So if I had to pinpoint a problem right now, or the main cause here, I think it's the marketing quality. They certainly bought up enough. I mean, the marketing, it was a deluge of marketing. It was everywhere over the last few weeks. But I think the quality here, it didn't sell the connection back to The Shining in the right way. It definitely made the connection, but it didn't sell it in the right way, and it failed to get people hyped. I thought the campaign was pretty tired overall. The trailers felt pretty long and kind of just boring and not hypey. And like I've been saying for the last couple of years here, what gets people to come out to a movie? Like what gets them to spend $15 on opening weekend and spend 3-4 hours of their life? It's hype. It's spectacle. It's those, you have to have a spectacle. If it's not a spectacle, people are not going to see it. And that's what happened here. You know, it's so sad to see this, which is, you know, pretty well received movie, especially from the horror movie fans, it looks like, to perform so poorly versus something like Halloween 2018, which, you know, I saw opening weekend. I'm a horror nerd. I'm in that group. But I don't like that movie. Halloween 2018, I'm going to like Dr. Sleep. I can guarantee you right now, it's going to be a film that I'm going to enjoy, at least on some level. And then, you know, It Chapter 2, Us, it's a high quality horror film that it's not performing well at all, because I think they marketed it totally inappropriately. And I think the key point that Deadline brings up, they did not get the younger generations to show up for this. People under 25, they just didn't show up. And Deadline goes into deeper and talks about like the Latino audience was like 19%. Well, Latino audiences in general over-index on horror films, especially the Conjuring series. So if you look at those numbers, usually it's like 25-30% Latino. But for whatever reason, they tend to show up for horror films. They didn't show up for this. So a lost opportunity there. Young people didn't show up, and they didn't sort of target the right demographics. And they didn't create the spectacle is essentially what happened. And that's why it's failing. And I don't think the leg is going to be very good. They opened it up a couple weeks after Halloween. Not a smart move, in my opinion. Should have been a mid-October release. And they kind of they really screwed it up. So it was a huge sort of debacle here for Warner Brothers. It's going to go nowhere. I mean, it's going to be lucky to make $30 million, I think. I don't think Leg's going to be that great. So that was Dr. Sleep at number 2, 14.1 million. My guess on a drop for that next weekend, well, because it's so depressed opening weekend, it probably won't have like a 70% drop. My guess is probably like a 55% average drop for that. And so it'll probably leg it to 30, but like the real test, does it hit 50? No. And that's just pathetic that a movie like this is not going to hit $50 million. It doesn't make any sense. And I think they really screwed the movie with terrible marketing. Okay, so that was number 2. Number 3 was Playing with Fire. Let's talk about that one pretty quickly. 24% Rotten Tomatoes score, 20% from top critics. It only has 10 reviews. This is a children's film, essentially about firefighters. Andy Fickman is the director from Paramount Pictures, put this one out. John Cena's in the lead, and that's what you see in the posters and stuff. Verified audience score, 82%. All audiences, 74%. Cinema score for B+, post-track 50%, which is kind of low. Letterboxd was 46 versus other children's films, Toy Story 4, and it's kind of a stacked deck, 78 out of 100 versus this got a 46. But it tells you a story, right? This is not a good movie. Mary Poppins last year, 66 out of 100 versus this at a 46. Dog's Way Home, a little bit closer to this, 52. Christopher Robin at a 70. So critics hated this. The people who showed up to see it thought it was okay and ended up doing $12.8 million this weekend. Higher per theater average though than Dr. Sleep, which is insane. $4,100 per theater. Dr. Sleep, it's so sad to see it perform so poorly. Essentially lost to Playing with Fire, which is a completely throwaway movie, which they probably spent like 20 days filming and like who knows how much money to make it. It's going to end up making more money than Dr. Sleep, maybe. It's the business, man. It's up and down. Okay, so who went to go see Playing with Fire? Almost, 55% Caucasian, white folks, pretty average. Latinos were a little bit higher than normal. Usually they're like to 21, 23%. They're 28% here. Asian other was 13%. Low score for African Americans. Only 4% of the audience was African American. Usually they're like 11, 12. So that's so demographics kind of makes sense for a movie like this. Is it going to play well in the long term? I don't know. Like the thing is, the cinema score of a B+ and the verified audience score are pretty good for this. And a children's film automatically gets like a 3x multiple. So yeah, it's going to give Dr. Sleep a run for its money. Absolutely. Critics absolutely despise the film, but I don't know if that's going to hurt legs all that much. Okay, so that was number 3. So number 1 was Midway at 17.5. Number 2 was Dr. Sleep at 14.1. Playing with Fire at number 3, 12.8. And then number 4, our last wide release of the weekend, our new wide release would be Last Christmas from Universal. This one's directed by Paul Feig. Romantic comedy about Christmas. Apparently there's something about the ending. There's some hubbub going on. So don't read anything about it if you're going to go see it. I think there's some twists involved in the plot. 49% for Rotten Tomato critics. 55 actual score. They hated it. Top critics even worse. 41%, 51 actual score. So critics are not on board with this film. Verified audience score is 81% with an 82 score. All audience 77%, 80 score. So audiences kind of liked it, didn't love it. You can see it in the cinema score, specifically a B- cinema score. For something like this to be really successful and have good legs, you're going to need a B+, A- at least. Post-track was 60%. No definite recommend score on this one. Letterboxd was 60 out of 100. Kind of lines up with Yesterday, which did 62 this year. Long Shot, which did 68. The Big Sick a few years back did 72. Me Before You was a 64 score. So it's funny how consistent these rom-coms can be. Like even Yesterday, which got a lot of buzz, is only 62 with the film Twitter art house crowd, which I guess makes sense. I don't know. But I just don't think it's really a genre for that group of people, like, the film snods, film students. So 60 out of 100. So tracking on this was what? About 10 plus, it looked like. So it's kind of right in line with what they expected. I think they probably hoped for like mid-teens, like 14, 15. It's not going to get that high, only 11.6 this weekend. Budget was under $30 million. 61% female audience. They liked it a little bit better than men, which makes sense, but it was 74% to 69%. So nobody was really over the moon about it. This is just it's a strange movie. If you want to get a good laugh about this film, read the Rolling Stones review, which gave it 1 star. And then it's a hilarious review. And then Paul Feig, the director of this film, tweeted out back to them, basically, I don't know, like trolling them or something. It's a funny exchange. And the review is hilarious. Just read the review. It's very, I don't know, the film itself. And I went through a couple of the sort of user reviews who people have seen it. And it seems pretty straightforward. You either like the sort of plot twist that happens or you don't. It's not really a big deal. And I don't get Paul Feig. He did A Simple Favor, which I thought I was going to love, and kind of flew under the radar and made some good money last year. Was it last year or this year? I think it might have been this year. I don't remember. I think that like he has a really, like, ever since Ghostbusters, it's just been strange because he did Bridesmaids, which is one of the biggest comedies of the last decade. And it's almost like he hasn't really found his footing. He makes movies that make money, so nobody's probably pissed at him except Ghostbusters, which lost a lot. And I'm sure Last Christmas is going to do okay because they kept the production budget low. It just, why is Paul Feig slumming it with movies like this? It just doesn't really add up to me. And maybe this is the movies that he can get made. I don't know. Emma Thompson's also in this. I think she also co-produced it. But I think, is this one also released too early now for Christmas? I don't know. It's gotten really cold in the US, so it feels like it's almost winter is here, essentially. So 11.6 probably closes out at about, I don't know, probably $30 million. All these movies are probably going to end up right around the same range. If anyone's going to break out, it's probably, I guess none of them feel like they're going to break out. They're just, none's a really great movie. Dr. Sleep, maybe word of mouth spreads on that one, can do pretty well, but it's going to be kind of like 30s, 40s for all of these. Okay, so that's the top 4. Let's blast through the rest of the top 10 and get to the timeline here. Terminator Dark Fate, 10.8 million, 63%. Oh, that's awful. I didn't see this number yet. 63% drop in its second weekend. Someone's losing $100 million at least. Terminator Dark Fate is the end of the series. I don't know what Paramount was thinking. It was just, it sounds like a disaster from the start. At least $100 million in losses, probably more like 130, 150. And hopefully we'll get a decent Terminator reboot, like a TV show or something on Netflix or Amazon or Apple TV. It doesn't matter, because it's a cool narrative universe, but they have just, I don't know. And the film isn't really supposed to be that bad. it's just, I don't know what it is about these. Anything post T2 just never works. It's been what, 25 years, 28 years, almost 30 years since we had a good Terminator movie, or at least one that performed well. So wow, that's really bad. A 63% drop. It was already a terrible opening. You would figure the second weekend drop would be low because, you know, it was so depressed opening weekend, but that's not the case. Wow, that's awful. Not awful's Joker, which is gonna cross $1 billion. It's at 313 now domestically. Let's see if I can't pull up these worldwide numbers on the Joker here real quick. Yeah, 984 it looks like worldwide. That'll hit $1 billion eventually. They're just gonna keep running it. There's something about it worldwide that people love this movie. I don't know what it is. Right character, right actor, right director, right tone and vibe at the right time all across the world. Very rarely happens. But it happened with the Joker. It is the definition of a grand slam at the box office. I mean, Warner Brothers, they might lose some money on Dr. Sleep. They're going to all make up for that and some with the performance of Joker, which I think was shot for like what? I don't even know, like 30 million or something. I can't remember what the production budget was on the Joker. But it wasn't very high, I don't think, at all. Not for a typical comic book movie. But Joker's just amazing performance, probably the top 3 story of the year. Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, $88 million this weekend, 39% drop, good drop. Gonna break $100 million here, probably this week. Not a great performance for that film at all. It's probably gonna lose money, but I don't think Disney cares because they're gonna try to just use it to sell Disney Plus subscriptions. Number 8 was Harriet. Still in, this one's its second weekend. It's kind of an art house-ish from Focus Features. Definitely an awards type film. 7.2 million, great drop, 38%. Has made about $23 million at the domestic box office. That's an okay performance. I can't really read that film. Like, it seems like it wasn't shot for that much. I'm not sure what the releasing strategy for Focus Features is with this. But it's an okay performance. It's not flopping. It's not really breaking out. It's kind of just middle of the road, but it's decent. Zombieland Double Tap was 9, 4.3 million, 42% drop, $66 million. That's a good run for that. You can't complain with that amount. Addams Family still sticking around, $91 million domestically. I don't get it. I just don't get why that film's doing so well. 4.1 million this weekend, 51% drop. Still in 2,600 theaters in its 5th weekend. Really good performance to the Addams Family. Okay, quickly before we get the timeline, anything outside the top 10 we want to talk about? Jojo Rabbit, big expansion. 5,000 per theater essentially, and did 3.9, almost $4 billion this weekend. Now sits at 9.1 million. An okay performance. I don't think it's going to break out and make 30, 40, but it's racking up dollars every weekend, so that's good for Fox Searchlight and also very good for awards contention. Parasite, also doing really well. $11.2 million for that movie so far. Like, how is that making that money? You know, you see here 11.2, it's like, that's not much money, but like for a movie like Parasite, for what it is, that's a really good performance. Motherless Brooklyn, Warner Brothers, another flop from them. Only dropped 36% this weekend, but it started out so low. It's at $7.3 million total in the second weekend. That's so bad. Honey Boy came out this weekend. That's one we got to talk about. So that is the Shia LaBeouf, whatever. You know what it is. You know who he is. He's been all over news recently, and like, you know, I didn't know that much about his background, and this is a autobiographical movie. He plays his own father. He had a really strange childhood, and he's a very odd guy, and he's publicly sort of shown that in a lot of sort of getting arrested, a lot of drug problems, drinking issues, and just kind of being a total fuck up. And still getting in a lot of movies and roles. He's very talented though, and always has been. And he had the Peanut Butter Falcon earlier this year that did very well. I think he's just sort of he seems a little bit more at peace with himself these days. He's been on like he was on what was it, Jimmy Kimmel. He was really funny. He was on that Hot Wings show, Hot Ones. He was awesome on that show. One of the better episodes I've ever seen of that. He really is like, there's something about him where he just seems a little bit more, he's always going to be super eccentric and a little bit out there, but he seems a little bit more tame now, which I think is very good for his career. So Honey Boy, $72K per theater on a platform release of 4 theaters. That's New York, Los Angeles. Probably the ArcLight, probably Angelica in New York. So I think that might be the highest per theater average of the year so far. Just a wonderful performance for that film. I think Parasite might have had the second highest. But yeah, anything over 50K on 4 screens or 4 theaters is amazing. 72K definitely puts it in the higher echelon here. Is it going to break out as the next question outside New York, Los Angeles? I don't think so. It's a little bit too arty, it seems like. So I don't see that happening. Anything else limited releases we got to talk about? I don't see the Lighthouse listed. See, sometimes the numbers doesn't list certain films because maybe like A24. I saw the Lighthouse this weekend. I've never been, I think it's the most disappointing viewing experience I think I've had in a long time. I did not like the movie at all. There's certainly aspects, but there is no way that movie plays. I have no idea why they put that out wide release. I have no clue why it's playing in a suburban theater in St. Louis where I go to see movies. It does not belong there. I'm happy that they have it there, but like that's not the audience for that film. The Lighthouse should exclusively play in old theaters in city centers that have been around for at least 50 years, like the Oriental in Milwaukee. And that's the only place it should ever play. And it can play it for months. That's fine. But it should not. Seeing the Lighthouse in a mall movie theater just doesn't feel right. That's not going to do any real money anyways. Okay, let's turn it over to Chris, and he's going to talk about 1994 and then talk about 3 new movies that are coming out. Here's the Time Machine on the Wildline podcast.
Hey, welcome to the Wildline Time Machine. My name's Chris. Thanks as always, Dan, for having me on to talk about the past and future of the American box office. We are shooting back to the same year that I started with the Time Machine on, trying to do, a little recap of every 5 or so years, both in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and maybe even shoot back a little bit earlier to 2014 next week, but I'm revisiting 94 again because it's just a fascinating year. We are looking back at 25 years into the past, and this weekend back in 94 was a doozy. Such a strange trio of films, all completely different audiences, demographics, but absolutely all 3 kind of mega hits in their own right. All fell within the top 15 overall of the domestic box office for the year of 1994, and 2 of them were debuts. One of them was holding on to number 3 in its 3rd week. Let's start at number 1. It was the week that Interview the Vampire came out. Why this movie came out 2 weeks after Halloween back in 94, who knows? Maybe that wasn't a thing then, but clearly it didn't matter. This movie made $36 million on its debut, holding the top spot, and this is only on a $60 million budget. Obviously, there was a lot of hype. It's based on a best-selling novel. It's bringing together Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise on screen for the first time, and yet it still kind of seemed like a shock that a vampire film that wasn't based on Bram Stoker's Dracula was taking over so much of the box office share that weekend. Speaking of Bram Stoker's Dracula, that was kind of like the only other notable vampire film of the 90s. There was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but that was a flop. There was Kronos, Guillermo del Toro's kind of infamous debut for American cinemas. That movie made no money, though, by the way. I checked it out. It didn't even break $1 million in America back in 93 when it came out. But Bram Stoker's Dracula in 92 probably was the second coming of the vampire film in American cinema. It made $82 million back in 92, and so it only made sense then to adapt Anne Rice's breakthrough pop novel with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in the lead. You had Tom Cruise fresh off The Firm, making $158 million. Can you imagine a movie like The Firm? It's just a guy running around trying to, get documents or something. I don't know. I slept through that movie back in the 90s. That made $158 million. Of course, John Grisham, once again, pop novels was like huge source material for movies back in that day, perhaps even more so than now. I mean, you've got your Gillian Flynn's and what have you, but this is huge. This is like, you take the New York Times bestseller list, and it's like the trashiest, soap operatic style writing, and as long as it's got Grisham or Clancy or Anne Rice on the cover, it's probably going to be made into a hit film. And then you had Also, of course, A Few Good Men. Once again, what's with Tom Cruise and the legal thrillers in the early 90s? And he made them pop. Like, it was huge. 141 million for A Few Good Men. Brad Pitt is interesting because I feel like everybody was, I was only 10 or 11 when Interview with the Vampire came out, but everybody was all about Brad Pitt. And yet he really wasn't a huge box office draw. And maybe he never really was. He was more of like a celebrity gossip, just like sex symbol. As we see now today, like Ad Astra made no money. Of course, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood made tons, but maybe that had less to do with him, though he's definitely plays his kind of sex symbol self in that. But he perhaps got that status back in 92 with The River Runs Through It. Tons of awards for that movie, but it only made 43 million at the box office, which is not bad for like a drama, especially about like fly fishing or something. I don't know. I never saw it. But then amazingly, his name bursts on the scene, but then he comes out with both True Romance and California with a K, in 1993. Neither of those films made money. True Romance actually made more than California, and he had like a bit part in that. His starring role in California only netted the film $2 million at the box office that year. So I don't know exactly what's going on with, Brad Pitt's cultural cachet, but it definitely didn't translate to box office dollars until Interview with the Vampire. It made over 105 million by the end of the year, broke the top 10, one of the only rated R films to do so, number 9 overall. Crazy stuff. Neil Jordan, hot off The Crying Game, which only made 62 million, but that's still a lot of money for what it was, like a domestic IRA drama thriller type thing that of course led to lots of awards and name recognition for him, but he hasn't really made a hit since Interview the Vampire. That was kind of his zenith, unfortunately. The Santa Claus was number 2 that weekend, really early on the Christmas movies, late on the Halloween, early on the Christmas, who knows. It's also its debut with 19 mil in the second spot, only on a $22 million budget. This seemed like fish in a barrel. Like you had the star and the producer from the highest rated non-news show of 1993, 1994, Home Improvement. It was second only to 60 Minutes, 20.4 Nielsen rating. So that's like over 20% of America. 1 out of every 5 people was watching Home Improvement on a regular basis. That's insane to me. Of course, I was one of those people. My family, definitely down with the Tool time. But it's insane that translated so easily to box office dollars. Especially because Tim Allen's like, was he like charismatic? He had the sound effects, with the raw and what have you, but it never really seemed like that should have translated very well. But of course now he's the iconic Buzz Lightyear, and he's off the cocaine, so good for him. But he's a Republican, so fuck him. Compared to the Santa Claus to like Christmas movies from the previous year, like that was a pretty sad year in 93. 50 million for Nightmare Before Christmas. Of course that went on to become legendary. 2 million though only for the Nutcracker in 93. So like Santa Claus, winding up with over $101 million, number 14 picture of 94. It definitely brought back kind of that Christmas movie genre. Interesting fact, the director kind of went on to do nothing. He tried to reteam with Tim Allen for Jungle to Jungle in 93, and he did end up making a moderate hit with Miss Congeniality 2 with 55 million in 2005. But John Pasquin, not really notable for his directing skills. It was just kind of like you had the gimmick and you had the actor, and that's all you needed. The producer too, of course, got to get those dollars. Number 3 for that week was a movie that was still holding on the top 3 in its 3rd week of release. Perhaps one of my most nostalgic films of the 90s. It's Stargate, with 8 million for that week, weekend 45 of 94. Only on a $55 million budget, it had already made almost close to 60 million by this point. So you have them easily making their budget back. Number 13 of the year overall. And of course, it launched the careers of producer Dean Devlin and director Roland Emmerich. I mean, these guys just cashed in at the right time. They saw Spielberg do Jurassic Park the previous year, which made $402 million domestic. And they're like, we can make like a scary sci-fi movie, but bring it in under the R radar, PG-13. That's the sweet spot. It doesn't even matter if it has like James Spader in the lead role as like a nerdy scientist, and it involves like Egyptians and portals, and it's such a silly idea for a film. And maybe that's just what, made it hit at the right time. Like, it was an alien movie, but it wasn't exactly an alien movie. It was, a adventure epic, but not really, because it was super strange. Like, compare that to Fire in the Sky, probably the only other like big alien movie that came out in the past year, and that movie only made $19 million. So they, of course, then hit the mother lode 2 years later, I should say, with Independence Day, which made I did not know this. Independence Day made $817 million. That's more than twice as much as Jurassic Park. That's crazy to think about in retrospect. Of course, they totally screwed the pooch and waited way too long, 20 years to make the sequel. That only made $103 million, which is still not bad, but I don't think it even, that probably not even break even compared to the original. So where did Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich come from? They had made Universal Soldier in 92, this like trashy Dolph Lundgren, Jean-Claude Van Damme sci-fi flick, rated R, like on the heels of T2 Judgment Day. But that movie only made 36 mil, but it was enough. Probably profit margin was pretty good. Neither of those actors probably cost too much to get in there. And, they said, what if we do something similar? It's just like totally crazy, doesn't make sense, sci-fi, action, but we bring in the tweens, and they got me there. I saw that movie in the theater, I think at least 3 times, and I wore out my VHS tape. I read the novelization of Stargate. I never got into the TV show with MacGyver guy, but it was quite a weird movie to be such a big hit back then, especially for, once again, a movie starring James Spader, who was not a box office reliability at that time. He was notable for his breakthrough role in Sex, Lies, and Videotape in '89, and he had side roles in Bob Roberts and Wolf. But other than that, it's like he's your lead of your big sci-fi adventure blockbuster. Strange. Kurt Russell, though, also incredible in that movie. He had the 3 credits around this time period, 3 completely different roles. He played Wyatt Earp in Tombstone and the year before, and then Captain Ron the year before that. God, I love that man. I just wish that he had more opportunities for these kinds of crazy roles where he could he's like a chameleon back then, between the drunken sailor and the Western cowboy and the hard-edged colonel from Stargate. Okay, so that's 94. Let's look into the future, guys. There was 3 movies that were announced this week that I'd like to take a closer look at. Probably the first of which is, speaking of strange, this is the biopic about Tammy Faye and Jerry Falwell. You think that's just like, kind of an Adam McKay fish in a barrel kind of thing, but this one is not going to be that easy to pin down. I think it's gonna be directed by Michael Showalter, so maybe he's taking the Adam McKay route. This is the guy that directed The Big Sick. He's originally from the comedy troupe Stella and The State. He's from Wet Hot American Summer, and yet he is probably doing something pretty straightforward, though maybe there's going to be like a strange satirical bent to it. But take a look at his movies like The Baxter and The Big Sick. Like he likes the kind of classical traditional, like Frank Capra style filmmaking. So for him to like take something so controversial, I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. Jessica Chastain's in the title role. She's also producing. The script's going to be written by Abe Sylvia, who wrote several episodes of Nurse Jackie and a few of the more recent Dead to Me. And I don't know what to make of this. I like Chastain a lot as an actor. Her production credits are kind of spotty. I don't know if she has the best eye for it. But, you also have Andrew Garfield as the son of the family, Cherry Jones as Tammy Faye's mom. Vincent D'Onofrio is playing Jerry Falwell. That was recently announced this week. It seems stacked. It seems like it's propped up for success, but relying on the script of a quasi-successful TV writer, I'm not sure. But who knows? Fox Searchlight picked it up. They have not had a great year. Their biggest hit was Ready or Not, which what Dan has talked about on the podcast, not making tons of money and kind of whizzed in and out of the theaters despite good reviews. I didn't even get to catch it, and I really wanted to. Though they had, of course, the huge hit 2 years ago of The Shape of Water. So maybe this will be Fox Searchlight. It's definitely ripe for Oscar material for 2020, 2021. We'll see when it gets done. Next, there's a movie called The Plane. Gerard Butler's been in the news this week a lot because it's been announced that on the heels of Angel Has Fallen's huge run of $69 million, which is not a huge number, but huge considering probably the low budget of the film, that kind of trashy B-movie sweet spot that he's been going for. He's also got another movie in the works called The Plane, which sounds, speaking of the 90s earlier, like a 90s story. And we know that hasn't worked out for a lot of recent movies like Gemini Man, which literally took its script from the 90s. But this sounds fun. It's about a pilot, like a commercial pilot played by Gerard Butler, who lands his storm-damaged airplane in a war zone, and then several militias kind of try to take control of it, and he kind of fights them off. So it's kind of like, I don't know, Air Force One meets Captain Sully or whatever that movie was. It was just called Sully, I think. I don't know. It could be a fun little premise, but once again, where are they getting these scripts? This is co-written by Charles Cumming, who wrote the novel of the same name, probably like a Tom Clancy style pop novel, maybe like Jack Reacher style. And then also co-written by J.P. Davis, who has not done much, but he's got like 3 different movies in the works, including another one called Violence of Action, starring Chris Pine. Violence of Action, isn't that kind of redundant for a movie title? I don't know. Anyways, De Bonaventura picked this one up, who made Angel Has Fallen, but also made Pet Sematary, which was a moderate flop, and Replicas from last year, which was a crazy big flop. Lionsgate's distributing, so maybe they'll do the right marketing for this kind of thing to once again kind of hit that sweet spot of B-movie trashiness, but over the top enough that it's not just boring. They had a huge hit with John Wick 3, but they also had a huge bomb with Anna this year. I don't know. We'll see. That one is not as much a fish in the barrel, I think, as The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Last but not least, Guy Ritchie finally announced his Aladdin follow-up, and yeah, you guessed it, he's going back to his comfort food with teaming up once again with Jason Statham. And it's crazy to think about, like, Jason Statham and Guy Ritchie had huge years this year, and yet they didn't have that huge year together. So it makes sense, it's kind of cute. They're coming back together to make a movie called Cash Truck. So yeah, Jason Statham had a big year with Hobbs and Shaw. Last year was big for him too with The Meg. Like, can we just officially say it? Like, Jason Statham, yeah, he's a trashy actor, but he is a star. He has been a star for a long time now, and maybe it just finally takes 2 trashy movies like The Meg and Hobbs and Shaw to make us all realize that, like, this guy's bankable. Give him the right script, give him the right hook, and he will deliver for you. I know Dan has talked about, Hobbs and Shaw maybe not being as big of a hit as the Fast and Furious franchise would have wanted, but still 173 millions, nothing to sneeze at. And of course, Guy Ritchie with Aladdin, 355 million total. He probably just got a blank check, which is pretty impressive after only making 39 mil for King Arthur a couple of years ago. So good for him, and good for both of those to get back to what they do best together. This doesn't even sound interesting. It's a revenge story that takes place, quote, across timelines and perspectives. So yeah, it's just like a Pulp Fiction style non-linear ripoff. Cold, mysterious character who works at a cash trunk company. It's based off a French film from 2004 that wasn't even a hit in France. It made $3 million, but maybe that's just enough of a hook. You got him driving a truck, an armored truck full of cash, and he's gonna fulfill his mission no matter what. Maybe there'll be twists and turns, and he's actually a villain. I don't know. I don't know. I can't even muster up the interest enough to see it, and I enjoy Jason Statham's screen presence, but yet I have no interest in seeing Hobbs and Shaw or The Meg. So who's to say? This one's gonna be put out by MGM. They've been having a good fall with The Addams Family, racking up at 88 million and counting. But they also had a not so great spring and summer with movies like The Hustle and Fighting for My Family. So I think they know that they're more a genre studio. They shouldn't really be trying something that is too outside the box, and yet they really shouldn't be trying for moderate hits either. They should be trying for things like The Addams Family. They're big gambles, but seems like things like that pay off. Don't make it too new, but also don't make it too trashy. So I can't imagine. It's called Cash Truck. Like, they didn't even try with that title. Anyways, that's it for me, the Wildline Time Machine this week. Thanks for listening. My name's Chris, and I'll throw it back over to Dan, and I'll be back next week. Have a good one.
So let's talk about Stargate really quickly. I too worshiped that film when it came out. I thought it was like the coolest thing ever, the coolest concept ever. And then I rewatched it this year with a friend, and I was super excited. The first half hour lived up to my nostalgia. I was like, oh my God, this is so good. What a cool concept. And then they get over to the other world, and I was like, oh, this is still pretty good. Kurt Russell's amazing in the movie. James Spader. And then the story starts to take off, or doesn't take off, I should say, in the new part of the new world, new planet that they're on. And then by the final third, I was like, this is an awful script. And like, this is boring. And it seems like TV writing versus film. It doesn't seem like a film level of writing. And by the end of it, I basically fell asleep, and I was like, wow, that last part of that movie was much, much worse than I remember. I only remember the good parts. So I am a little bit off the Stargate train, unfortunately. It's still one of the coolest concepts of any sci-fi movie I've seen. But I think the final results of the film are just do not live up to the nostalgia I had for it. Interview with the Vampire. Santa Claus I'm not going to talk about because I don't want to. Interview with the Vampire. The interesting thing about that is when It Chapter 1 was doing so well, I had to do, I had to research from horror films and just see what was the biggest horror film of all time. Interview with the Vampire is essentially, before it, the biggest horror film box office wise ever. And so without going back to like, the 70s and stuff like that, with the data set that we have in the last 30 years, it was just massive, and it was huge, and it made all these people's careers back then. And then horror, you would think, 90s is not really known for being a banner year in horror, a banner decade of horror. And it wasn't really. It was kind of a weird trough for the genre. Obviously, there are always exceptions, and there's always great filmmaking being made. But as a whole, that decade was pretty quiet. You just had, this massive peak of Interview with the Vampire doing so well. And then by the time It comes along 2 years later, the genre essentially flipped over on its head. Interview with the Vampire was definitely just a massive, massive film back then. And it's hard if you didn't live or weren't alive back then. I was only like 12 years old, but I can remember it being everywhere. I remember Kristen Dunst winning, I guess, did she win the Oscar for that movie? And it was just so awkward because she was so young. It was just like a bizarre moment. But it was definitely like pop culture extreme, and in like at the front of every magazine and stuff like that. Future films that he talked about, I thought were interesting. They all look pretty cool. I'm on board. Guy Ritchie, nah, pass. Cast Truck sounds whatever. The Plane sounds fun. Gerard Butler is just, he's like Steven Seagal in the 2010s. Like, he just does these action movies. They're fun action movies. I watch them. I expect nothing from them, and I just get a little bit, and that's all I need. Plane sounds just like that. Eyes of Tammy Faye sounds incredibly fascinating. Michael Showalter as the director alone is reason to be very interested in it. Jessica Chastain being involved as well is a very good sign. I will look out for that one. That one definitely seems like an awards movie. Something that would come on Neon or A24, obviously kind of, Vice or something like that. It definitely has that feel to it. But we'll see what the quality is. A movie like that, it has to be like 100. It has to be like in the 90% Rotten Tomatoes for it to have any buzz and to do well at all. If it doesn't have that, it just disappears off the face of the earth, essentially. But it sounds like that with Michael Showalter involved, I think it could get up on that really high top shelf tier. Okay, so that is mostly everything. Let's talk a little bit about what's going to come out over the next few weeks. Obviously, we're going to have these holdovers here with a lot of films. Dr. Sleep, maybe it starts to do well next week, and I doubt it, though. So we have Charlie's Angels, Ford vs. Ferrari, All Rise. I don't really know. That's from Entertainment Studios, Motion Pictures Company, whatever. Charlie's Angels, I don't think it's going to do very well. I could be wrong. Kristen Stewart does have a huge pull. It does seem like it might be connecting with younger people, and if that does happen, then that's a very good sign it's going to do well. Right now, I'm guessing high teens for that, but if it does break out, the sky's the limit. Could do 25, 35, somewhere in that range. Right now, I'd guess about 17, 18. Ford or Ferrari is going to be a hit. I can tell you right now, it's 100% a hit. That will end up, it's not going to open massive. It's not like a comic book movie opening, but legs for days, or in this case, months. It will play strong. all the way through New Year's. People are going to be seeing it around Christmas and New Year's. It's going to play at least 2 months straight. It's going to be doing well. Where is it going to end up? I think it goes over $100 million pretty easily. I would say 130, 140, somewhere in that range. It's going to be a big win for everybody involved there. Christian Bale, Matt Damon. The 20th Century Fox film could get a lot of awards contention. It doesn't necessarily have sort of the cachet for that, maybe. It seems a little bit kind of middlebrow. But we'll see. The thing is, even if it's middlebrow and it's not the best movie ever, if it performs incredibly well at the box office, it will win awards, i.e. Green Book, which was a fine film, but was not high art by any stretch of imagination, and it won Best Picture. So that is possible if it does well. 21 Bridges, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Frozen 2 on the 22nd. Frozen 2, Box Office Pro is saying like 150 for that opening, but like it's already broken every pre-ticket sale ever, including Toy Story 4. So like it's definitely going to make $200 million opening weekend, it seems like. I could be off on that because it is November, blah, 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 blah. But it's also Frozen 2. Like it's probably the biggest animation film of the last 10 years. So I think it's going to have a pretty easy way to get to $200 million opening weekend. Knives Out, Queen and Slim. Queen and Slim looks really fascinating. I definitely want to see that movie. Definitely a lot of sort of film Twitter hype on that one. Is that going to translate to normal audiences? Probably not. Seems a little too edgy for them. Knives Out is kind of a wild card. I don't know. A month ago, I thought it was going to be a breakout huge hit, but now with like Dr. Sleep not doing well, is Knives Out like maybe get it a little bit too old? I'm not sure. I think it's going to do well, but I don't know if it's going to break out and do like $150 million domestically. Then in December, Aeronauts, A Million Little Pieces. I didn't know A Million Little Pieces was coming out. Black Christmas, another remake of Black Christmas. I felt like we just had one, but that was probably 10 years ago. Jumanji, I forgot the new Jumanji movie is coming out on the 13th. Then December 20th, Cats, which apparently is having a very hard time in post-production. It may not get released on the 20th. It may get pushed back. I mean, that movie's a total shit show. Everybody knows it. The moment that trailer was released, probably like my favorite. There's always these moments where a trailer gets released and the film was just like so off the wall and no one has any idea what's going on. It just creates the ultimate meme hype. Cats was perfect for that. Like I just spent like an hour reading tweets and just laughing the entire time. And maybe that'll translate to good box office. I doubt it though. Star Wars Rise of the Skywalker, the last one in this new trilogy, is coming out on the 20th. No idea what's going on with that movie. No idea if it's going to do well. Are we talking $150 million opening? Are we talking $250 million opening? I couldn't tell you. Bombshell, look out for this one. I mean, the buzz on this is off the charts. We're talking like huge acting nominations for probably Margot Robbie, Charlize Theron, Nicole Kidman. It's going to be big, especially for awards. In terms of box office, I think it's going to do pretty well. I think you can get older people to show up for it. I think younger people might show up for it too a little bit, but it looks great. Little Women on the 25th on Christmas, and Spies in Disguise. Little Women, the hype on this one's super high, but maybe that's just on the Twitter world where people keep tweeting about it. But younger people are super into that movie because of the cast. So we'll see how well that does, if that translates over. And that's through the end of the year, essentially. So, okay, so that's it, folks. We will be back next weekend with a timeline segment. I'll be back. We'll talk about the top 10. And we'll see how Charlie's Angels and Ford versus Ferrari does on their wide release debut. Thanks, folks. This has been the Wildline Podcast.